I chose to live modestly, working as a simple guest services clerk while keeping my billionaire inheritance secret. When an arrogant hotel owner decided to humiliate me for being ordinary, he had no idea he was about to face the wrath of one of the world's most powerful men, my father. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena, and 6 months ago, if you had seen me walking through the marble lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, you would have thought I was just another entry-level employee trying to make her way in the hospitality industry. I wore simple navy blazers from department stores, carried a basic leather purse that had seen better days, and took the subway to work every morning like millions of other young professionals in the city. Most people who interacted with me saw exactly what I wanted them to see: a 26-year-old woman working hard to build her career from the ground up, living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment, grateful for every tip and every kind word from guests. But the thing about deliberate simplicity is that it requires more strength than most people imagine, especially when you're walking away from a life of unimaginable privilege. Every morning at 7:30 sharp, I would badge into the Grand Meridian Hotel through the employee entrance, past the loading docks and service corridors that guests never see. The contrast between the gleaming marble and gold fixtures of the lobby and the utilitarian concrete walls of the back-of-house areas served as a daily reminder of the choice I had made. I had traded silk gowns and charity galas for polyester uniforms and staff meetings, and somehow I had never felt more authentic. The Grand Meridian wasn't just any hotel. It was a legendary establishment that had hosted presidents, celebrities, and royalty for over a century. The kind of place where a single night in the presidential suite cost more than most people's monthly rent. Where the concierge could secure impossible reservations, and the staff anticipated guests' needs before they were even articulated. Working there was considered a privilege in the hospitality industry, a stepping stone to bigger and better opportunities. My colleagues were a mix of seasoned professionals and ambitious newcomers, all united by a shared commitment to excellence that the Grand Meridian demanded. There was Patricia, the head of guest relations, who had worked her way up from housekeeping over 15 years and could handle any crisis with grace and efficiency. James worked the front desk and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the city that made him invaluable to tourists and business travelers alike. And then there was Rosa, the youngest member of our team, fresh out of hospitality school and eager to prove herself in one of the most demanding environments in the industry. These people had become my chosen family over the past 6 months. They knew me as Elena Rodriguez, the girl who brought homemade sandwiches for lunch, who volunteered for extra shifts during busy periods, and who genuinely cared about making every guest's stay memorable. They had no idea that I was Elena Worthington, daughter of Jonathan Worthington, whose real estate empire included some of the most valuable properties in 3 countries, whose personal wealth was measured in the tens of billions, whose influence extended from Wall Street to Washington. The decision to live this double life hadn't been made lightly. Growing up as the heir to the Worthington fortune had meant a childhood of privilege that most people could never imagine. But it had also meant growing up in a bubble where genuine relationships were nearly impossible to form. Every friendship was potentially motivated by my family's wealth. Every romantic interest might be more interested in my trust fund than in me as a person. And every achievement was viewed through the lens of advantage rather than merit. By the time I graduated from Stanford with degrees in both business and hospitality management, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of expectations and assumptions. Everyone knew who I was before I even spoke. Everyone had preconceived notions about my capabilities and my character, and I had begun to wonder if I would ever know who I really was underneath all the privilege and protection that surrounded me. The breaking point had come during a board meeting at Worthington Holdings, where I was supposed to be learning the family business. I had presented a detailed analysis of potential improvements to our hotel portfolio, backed by months of research and genuine insights from my studies. The response from the other board members had been polite applause and patronizing smiles, followed by comments about how nice it was to see young Miss Worthington taking such an interest in the family business. Not a single person had engaged with the substance of my presentation or treated my ideas as worthy of serious consideration. That night, I had called my father and told him I needed time to figure out who I was when nobody knew my last name. He had been skeptical at first, worried about my safety and concerned about the risks of living without the protection that came with our family's resources. But ultimately, he had understood my need for authenticity, for the chance to prove myself based on merit rather than birthright. The arrangement we had worked out was simple in theory, but complex in execution. I would live under an assumed name, work a regular job, and experience life as an ordinary person for 1 year. My father would provide minimal financial support, enough to cover basic living expenses, but nothing that would set me apart from my colleagues. The luxurious penthouse apartment that had been my home since college would remain empty, while I learned to navigate life in a 400-square-foot studio with thin walls and unreliable heating. The first few weeks had been harder than I had anticipated. Simple tasks that I had never thought about. Grocery shopping on a budget, doing laundry in a shared facility, figuring out public transportation, required skills I had never needed to develop. There were moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether this experiment was worth the discomfort and uncertainty it brought. But gradually something beautiful had begun to emerge from the challenges. For the first time in my life, I was forming relationships based purely on who I was as a person, rather than what I represented. My colleagues valued my work ethic. My guests appreciated my genuine care for their comfort, and I was discovering strengths and capabilities that had nothing to do with my family's wealth or influence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The work itself was more rewarding than any board position or charity committee I had ever been part of. When Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow celebrating her 50th wedding anniversary alone, broke down in tears at the front desk, it was my shoulder she cried on, and my suggestion that we comp her room and arrange for flowers that turned her painful trip into a healing experience. When the Johnson family arrived for their first vacation in 5 years, only to discover that their reservation had been lost, it was my problem-solving skills and determination that found them an even better room and turned a potential disaster into a memorable stay. These interactions filled me with a sense of purpose that no amount of inherited wealth had ever provided. I was making a difference in people's lives through my own efforts, my own choices, my own dedication. The simple uniform I wore each day represented something that my designer dresses never had: the dignity of honest work and the satisfaction of earning respect rather than inheriting it. My father had been surprisingly supportive of my choice, though I knew he worried constantly about my safety and well-being. Jonathan Worthington was not a man accustomed to having his family members venture into the world without layers of protection and security, but he loved me enough to let me find my own path, even when that path led away from everything he had built and everything he had assumed I would inherit. We spoke every few days, usually in the evenings when I returned to my tiny apartment exhausted but oddly fulfilled by the day's work. He would ask about my job, my colleagues, my living situation, and though he never said it directly, I could hear both pride and worry in his voice. Pride that his daughter was discovering her own strength and capabilities, worry that she was doing so without the safety net that his wealth could provide. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I was working in the hospitality industry, serving people who in many cases had far less wealth than my family, while pretending to be someone who needed every tip and every hour of overtime to make ends meet. But the authenticity I had found in this life felt more real than anything I had experienced in 26 years of privilege. The relationships I was building were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than strategic advantage or social positioning. My small apartment, with its creaky floors and temperamental plumbing, felt more like home than the mansion I had grown up in. The simple meals I prepared on my tiny stove tasted better than the elaborate dishes prepared by our family's private chef. The conversations I had with my colleagues during our lunch breaks were more meaningful than the carefully orchestrated social interactions of charity events and society gatherings. But as with any experiment in authenticity, there were challenges and complications that I hadn't anticipated. The physical demands of the job were exhausting in ways that my privileged upbringing hadn't prepared me for. Standing for 8-hour shifts, dealing with difficult guests, managing the constant pressure of a high-end establishment. These were realities that no amount of theoretical knowledge could have prepared me for. More challenging than the physical demands, however, were the moments when my two worlds threatened to collide. The Grand Meridian was exactly the kind of establishment that members of my family's social circle frequented, and I lived in constant fear that someone would recognize me despite my changed appearance and assumed name. I had cut my hair shorter and dyed it a darker brown. I wore minimal makeup and simple glasses, but there was always the possibility that someone from my previous life would see through the disguise. The financial constraints were also more difficult than I had expected. Living on an entry-level salary after a lifetime of unlimited resources required adjustments that went beyond just budgeting and careful spending. It meant saying no to social activities that my colleagues took for granted. It meant wearing the same few outfits in rotation. It meant calculating whether I could afford both groceries and laundry in the same week. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of my new life was the constant awareness that it was, in some fundamental way, a performance. No matter how authentic my relationships felt, no matter how genuine my dedication to my work, there was always the underlying knowledge that I was choosing this life rather than being trapped in it. Unlike my colleagues, I had an escape route, a safety net, a return ticket to privilege whenever I decided I'd had enough of ordinary life. This knowledge created a complex emotional landscape that I struggled to navigate. On one hand, I felt guilty about the deception, about the fact that my struggles were temporary and voluntary, while theirs were permanent and necessary. On the other hand, I felt that the authenticity of my relationships and the value of my work weren't diminished by the fact that I had chosen this path rather than having it chosen for me. The Grand Meridian itself was a constant reminder of the world I had temporarily left behind. Every day, I watched wealthy guests arrive in luxury cars and private jets, staying in suites that cost more per night than I now made in a month. I saw the easy confidence that came with never having to worry about money, the casual assumption that every desire would be fulfilled and every need anticipated. Sometimes, watching these guests, I wondered if I had ever looked like that, if I had ever carried myself with that same unconscious arrogance, if I had ever treated service staff with the casual indifference that seemed to come so naturally to people who had never been on the other side of the transaction. The thought was uncomfortable, but it was also motivating. This experience was teaching me lessons about empathy and respect that no amount of privilege could have provided. The turning point in my carefully constructed simple life came on a crisp October morning when everything I thought I understood about respect, dignity, and human decency was shattered by one man's breathtaking arrogance. His name was Vincent Ashworth, and he owned the Platinum Crown Hotel Group, a collection of luxury properties that competed directly with establishments like the Grand Meridian. At 42, Vincent had inherited his father's hotel empire and expanded it aggressively, earning a reputation for ruthless business practices and an ego that matched his bank account. Vincent was everything I had grown to despise about the world I had temporarily left behind. He carried himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from never being told no, never facing real consequences, and never having to consider how his actions affected people he considered beneath him. His perfectly tailored suits probably cost more than most people's cars, his watch collection was worth more than some people's houses, and he treated anyone in the service industry like they were barely human. I had heard stories about Vincent from my colleagues long before I met him. He was notorious in hospitality circles for his treatment of staff, his impossible demands, and his tendency to use his wealth and influence to destroy anyone who crossed him. Patricia had once worked at one of his properties and still shuddered when his name came up in conversation. According to her, Vincent viewed employees as disposable resources, to be used up and discarded without a second thought. The first time Vincent Ashworth walked into the Grand Meridian, I was working the afternoon shift at the guest services desk. He strode through the lobby like he owned the place, his entourage of assistants and security personnel trailing behind him like a parade of subservience. Everything about his presence screamed wealth and power, from his handmade Italian shoes to the way other guests instinctively moved out of his path. I recognized him immediately from business magazines and society pages, though I made sure my expression remained professionally neutral. In my previous life, I had attended the same charity events and social gatherings where Vincent was a regular fixture, always holding court with politicians and celebrities, always making sure everyone knew exactly how important and influential he was. Seeing him now from my position behind the guest services desk, I was struck by how different the view was from this side of the transaction. Vincent approached my desk with the casual confidence of someone who expected immediate attention and perfect service. He didn't make eye contact, didn't acknowledge me as a person, just began speaking as if I were a piece of hotel equipment designed to fulfill his needs. His voice was crisp and commanding, with the kind of tone that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need the Wellington suite for tonight," he announced, not bothering with pleasantries or basic courtesy. "Make sure it's properly prepared. I have specific requirements that I expect to be met exactly." He handed me a business card and a detailed list of demands that read more like a military operation than a hotel stay. Everything from the thread count of the sheets to the temperature of the room had to be precisely calibrated to his preferences. I reviewed his requirements professionally, making notes and checking our availability systems. The Wellington suite was indeed available, and while his demands were extensive, they weren't unreasonable for a guest of his caliber. I began processing his request, maintaining the kind of efficient, courteous service that the Grand Meridian was known for. "Sir, I'll be happy to arrange the Wellington suite for you," I said, my voice warm and professional. "I'll coordinate with housekeeping to ensure all your specifications are met. Will you be dining in the hotel restaurant this evening? Or would you prefer in-room service?" It was a standard question, the kind of anticipatory service that distinguished luxury hotels from ordinary accommodations. Vincent looked up from his phone for the first time since approaching my desk, and I saw his expression change as he really looked at me. His eyes traveled from my simple hairstyle to my department store blazer to my basic jewelry, and I watched his face transform from casual indifference to something much more unpleasant. It was a look I had learned to recognize during my months of living, simply the expression of someone who had just categorized me as unworthy of their respect. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his tone shifting from commanding to condescending. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with here. I own 17 luxury hotels across 3 countries. I've stayed in the finest accommodations in the world, and I've never had my needs handled by someone who looks like they should be working at a roadside motel." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were particularly creative or clever, but because of the casual cruelty behind them. This was a man who felt comfortable publicly humiliating someone based on nothing more than their appearance and perceived social status. I felt my cheeks burn, but I maintained my professional composure, determined not to give him the reaction he was clearly looking for. "I understand your expectations are high, Mr. Ashworth," I replied evenly, "and I assure you that the Grand Meridian staff is fully capable of meeting them. Would you like me to have our general manager personally oversee your accommodation arrangements?" It was a diplomatic way of escalating the situation while maintaining my dignity and the hotel's reputation. Vincent's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your general manager? Honey, I don't think you're getting the message here. Look at yourself. Look at where you work. You're a nobody serving people who actually matter. The fact that this hotel would put someone like you in a position to interact with guests of my caliber shows exactly why the Grand Meridian is falling behind properties like mine." Quote. His voice was getting louder, attracting attention from other guests and staff members in the lobby. I could see James at the front desk trying to catch my eye, probably wondering if he should intervene. Patricia was emerging from the office behind the desk, her expression concerned as she sensed the tension in the interaction. But I was determined to handle this professionally, to prove that dignity and respect weren't dependent on wealth or status. "Mr. Ashworth," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm, "I'm here to ensure your stay meets your expectations. If you'd prefer to work with a different team member, I'm happy to arrange that. Our priority is your comfort and satisfaction." It was exactly the kind of de-escalation technique we had been trained to use with difficult guests, designed to diffuse tension while maintaining service standards. But Vincent wasn't interested in de-escalation. If anything, my professional response seemed to irritate him further. He leaned across the desk, invading my personal space in a way that made several nearby guests visibly uncomfortable. His cologne was overwhelming, expensive, but applied too heavily, like everything else about him designed to announce his wealth and status. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that somehow felt more menacing than his earlier shouting. "You don't know your place. You think because you work at a fancy hotel you're somehow important. But you're not. You're a servant. You exist to make my life easier, and when you can't do that properly, you become worthless." The lobby had gone noticeably quieter, conversation stopping as people became aware of the scene unfolding at the guest services desk. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, some curious, some uncomfortable, some judgmental. In my previous life, I would have been one of those bystanders, probably looking away uncomfortably and grateful that I wasn't the target of such public humiliation. Patricia appeared at my shoulder, her professional smile firmly in place but her eyes flashing with anger. She had obviously heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, and I knew she was struggling with the balance between protecting her employee and maintaining the hotel's reputation for exemplary guest service. "Mr. Ashworth," Patricia interjected smoothly, "I'm Patricia Williams, head of guest relations. Perhaps I can personally ensure that your accommodation meets your exacting standards. Elena here is one of our most capable team members, but I'm always happy to provide additional oversight for our VIP guests." Vincent turned his attention to Patricia, looking her up and down with the same dismissive assessment he had given me. Patricia was in her 40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished professionalism that came from years of experience in luxury hospitality. But Vincent seemed to find her equally lacking in whatever arbitrary standards he had set for people worthy of his respect. "Both of you need to understand something," Vincent said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent lobby. "I didn't build a hotel empire by accepting mediocrity. When I walk into an establishment, I expect to be served by people who understand excellence, not by," he gestured vaguely at me, "whatever this is supposed to be." The insult was so casual, so effortlessly cruel, that it took my breath away. In 6 months of working at the Grand Meridian, I had dealt with demanding guests, frustrated travelers, and difficult situations, but I had never encountered someone who seemed to take pleasure in diminishing another person's humanity. Vincent wasn't just being rude or demanding, he was actively trying to make me feel worthless. "Sir," I said, my voice slightly less steady than before, "I'm doing my best to provide you with excellent service. If my appearance or background doesn't meet your standards, I apologize, but I'm fully qualified to handle your reservation and ensure your satisfaction." Vincent's eyes lit up at what he perceived as weakness in my voice. Like a predator sensing vulnerability, he pressed his advantage, moving closer to the desk and speaking loud enough to ensure that everyone in the lobby could hear his next words. "Qualified?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Sweetheart, you're working at a hotel guest services desk. This isn't a career, it's a way station for people who couldn't make it anywhere else. Look at your clothes. Look at your jewelry. Look at your entire presentation. You're exactly the kind of person who should be grateful for any attention from someone like me." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of cash, laying it on the desk between us like a challenge. The bills were hundreds, more money than I officially made in a week, and the gesture was clearly designed to emphasize the power dynamic he believed existed between us. "Here's what's going to happen," Vincent continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a child. "You're going to take this money, you're going to thank me for my generosity, and you're going to make sure my suite is perfect. Then you're going to remember this moment the next time you think you're too good to be grateful for the attention of people who actually matter in this world." The cash sat on the marble desk surface like an insult made tangible. Around us, the lobby had become a theater, with Vincent as the cruel protagonist and me as the unwilling victim of his performance. I could see hotel guests recording with their phones, probably posting to social media about the drama they were witnessing. Staff members were frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or let the situation play out. But as I stared at that money, something inside me began to shift. The humiliation was real, the anger was building, but underneath it all was a growing sense of resolve that surprised me with its intensity. Vincent Ashworth thought he knew everything about power and money and status. He thought he could identify who mattered and who didn't just by looking at them. But he had made one crucial mistake in his assessment. He had assumed that the young woman behind the guest services desk was powerless, that she had no recourse, no protection, no way to fight back against his cruelty. He had looked at my simple clothes and modest jewelry and concluded that I was exactly what I appeared to be. Someone who needed his money, someone who would swallow his insults for the sake of keeping her job, someone who existed at his mercy. What Vincent Ashworth didn't know, couldn't know, was that the phone in my pocket contained a direct line to one of the most powerful men in the world. A man who had built an empire that made Vincent's hotel chain look like a corner store. A man who loved me more than life itself, and who would move mountains to protect me from exactly this kind of cruelty. My father, Jonathan Worthington, was about to learn that someone had made the mistake of humiliating his daughter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.